In a quiet countryside town in England, surrounded by endless fields, scattered cottages, and narrow cobblestone roads, there stood an ancient stone bridge that had outlived generations. Its arches were covered in moss, its stones cracked by centuries of harsh rain, and its railings darkened with the scars of time. Locals rarely called it by its official name. Instead, they whispered another title, a name that carried both fascination and fear: the Bride's Bridge. The bridge itself was not remarkable at first glance. Tourists who occasionally passed by would think of it as just another piece of old English architecture, a relic from a forgotten age. But the people who lived nearby knew better. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as though uttering the name too loudly might summon the very thing they wished to avoid. Even children, who loved to dare one another with foolish games, never lingered on the bridge after dark. There was a reason for that. It was said that on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the river below, a figure could be seen standing at the very center of the bridge. The stories described her as a woman in a long wedding dress, her veil drifting in the cold night air, her hands clutching a bouquet of flowers that never wilted. She did not move. She did not speak. She only stood there, waiting, as though for someone who never arrived. Drivers who had crossed the bridge at night told of headlights catching the faint outline of her gown. Some said they slowed down, confused, thinking there had been a stranded bride, some lost traveler left behind after a wedding. But when they rolled down their windows to call out, or when they dared to stop their car, the figure would vanish into thin air. Others swore they had seen her turn her head, just slightly, and though her face was pale and hidden behind her veil, they felt an overwhelming sense of grief, as if her sorrow alone could suffocate them. The most frightening testimonies came from those who had to cross the bridge on foot. A farmer once confessed, with a trembling voice, that he had seen the woman up close while returning from a nearby village late at night. He claimed she was not standing but drifting, her feet not touching the ground. As he walked past, too afraid to look directly at her, he heard the soft rustle of her gown brushing the stone, though the wind that night was completely still. He swore that the air grew so cold that his breath turned into fog, and when he finally dared to glance over his shoulder, the bridge behind him was empty. Stories like these had circulated for years, passed down from parents to children, retold by pub owners to entertain guests, and even recorded in the local paper whenever a traveler reported something unusual. Still, nobody could explain the phenomenon. Skeptics argued it was only mist, shadows, or tricks of tired eyes. Yet the stories continued, persistent and chillingly consistent in detail. And among them was one element that never changed. The ghost was always described as a bride. But why a bride? Who was she? And what bound her to that bridge for all eternity? The townspeople had their theories. Some said she had died tragically on her wedding day, abandoned by her groom and overcome with grief. Others believed she had been murdered, her body thrown into the river below, doomed to haunt the place where her soul had last cried out in despair. There were those who even whispered of a curse, a pact made long ago that trapped her spirit until someone was willing to take her place. The truth was uncertain, but the fear was very real. The bridge became infamous not only among locals, but also among curious visitors who had heard the whispers. Teenagers dared each other to visit it at midnight, bringing flashlights and shaky nerves, recording their experiences on their phones. Most of the time, nothing happened. They laughed, told ghost stories, and left with relief. But sometimes, just sometimes, the recordings captured something else. A flicker of white in the distance, a voice too faint to be explained, or the sound of footsteps when no one else was there. Many of those videos never made it online. The people who filmed them claimed the footage was corrupted, or worse, that they were too afraid of what they had seen. One night, a group of friends from the city decided to visit after hearing the tale from a local bar. They were outsiders, skeptics looking for cheap thrills. With beers in hand and laughter on their lips, they drove to the bridge at midnight, parking their car just a few meters away. As they stepped out, the mist rose from the river, curling like fingers across the stone path. They mocked the story, calling out into the darkness, "Where's the bride? Show yourself." First, nothing happened. They laughed, slapped each other on the shoulders, and prepared to leave. But then the laughter died. The mist thickened, and in the distance, at the very heart of the bridge, something pale took shape. Figure. A woman in white. They froze. The night grew silent, unnaturally so. Not a bird, not a rustle of leaves, only the sound of their own shallow breathing. The woman stood perfectly still, her face hidden beneath a long veil, her head bowed as if in eternal mourning. They tried to convince themselves it was just another person, maybe another tourist. But then one of them noticed, her feet were not touching the ground. Panic spread quickly. One friend screamed, another dropped his drink, and they all bolted back to the car. But the driver fumbled with the keys, trembling too much to start the engine. And as the headlights flickered to life, they illuminated the bridge once more. It was empty. The bride was gone. For weeks afterward, those young men refused to speak of what they had seen. They left town in a hurry the very next morning, pale and silent, and the locals only shook their heads knowingly. They had heard the story before. They had heard it too many times. The legend of the bride's bridge was not just a story told for amusement. It was something that lingered, something that grew heavier with each retelling, as though the sorrow of the woman in white seeped into the hearts of those who dared to listen. And while some believed it was only folklore, others could not shake the feeling that the bride was real, that she still waited century after century at the center of the bridge for the groom who had abandoned her. And so, every evening when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the countryside, the bridge became a place avoided by even the bravest of souls. For if you looked too closely into the mist, you might just see her standing there, silent and still, her sorrowful gaze fixed on the emptiness before her, waiting, always waiting. But the most unsettling part of the legend was not the sightings, nor the chilling encounters, nor the strange happenings recorded on shaky cameras. It was the whispered question that haunted everyone who heard the tale. If she is waiting for her groom, what happens when she finally mistakes someone else for him? Long before the town grew into what it is today, before the pubs and shops and carriages that came with time, there was only farmland, thick woods, and the river that curved through the valley. On its banks, the villagers built the stone bridge, never knowing that it would become a place of sorrow. It was in this quiet countryside centuries ago that the story of Eliza first took root. Eliza was known across the village for her beauty, yes, but also for her kindness. She was the daughter of a farmer, raised in simplicity, her hands often dirty from tending the fields, her cheeks flushed from the cold winds of the English countryside. Despite her modest life, there was a light in her that drew people to her. She had long hair the color of chestnut, eyes that carried both innocence and a deep, unspoken longing, and a smile that seemed to lift the burdens of anyone who saw it. From a young age, she had been promised to a man named Thomas. Unlike Eliza, Thomas came from a family with a little wealth. He was charming, ambitious, and carried the air of someone who wanted more from life than the village could offer. To many, he was not entirely trustworthy, but to Eliza, he was everything. She believed his words, his promises, his whispered vows that he would always love her, no matter what paths their lives might take. And so, when Thomas proposed marriage, Eliza accepted without hesitation, convinced that fate had written their love into the very stars. The wedding was set for early spring. The entire village was to attend, for marriages in those days were not only unions between two people but between families, between livelihoods, between hopes and futures. Preparations stretched for weeks. Women sewed garlands of flowers, men polished the pews of the chapel, and Eliza's father sacrificed much of his savings to buy his daughter a gown worthy of her beauty. It was white silk, rare and expensive, and though simple by the standards of noble families, it shimmered like frost beneath the morning sun. On the morning of the wedding, the chapel bells rang, their sound echoing across the hills. Villagers gathered in anticipation, dressed in their best clothes, eager to witness what was promised to be a joyful occasion. Eliza was radiant, her hair carefully arranged, her dress flowing as though woven from moonlight itself. She clutched a bouquet of wildflowers, simple yet filled with meaning, as Thomas had once picked the very same flowers for her during their secret walks by the river. But as the hours passed, unease spread. The chapel grew crowded with whispers. The smiles faded into confusion, then concern. Thomas had not arrived. At first, people reassured Eliza, saying perhaps his carriage had been delayed, or perhaps he had been held up by family matters. But as minutes became an hour, and an hour became two, the murmurs turned into heavy silence. Eliza stood before the altar, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the door every few seconds. She refused to believe he would not come. Each time the wooden door creaked, her heart leapt, only to fall again when it was only another villager entering with pity in their eyes. By the third hour, even her father, who had once spoken proudly of the marriage, could not meet her gaze. The truth hung heavy in the air. Thomas was gone, abandoned, humiliated, shattered. They say Eliza's face in that moment was something no one could ever forget. Her lips quivered but no tears fell. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared not at the crowd but at the altar itself, as though asking the heavens why she had been forsaken. When at last she moved, it was sudden, startling. Without a word, she turned and ran from the chapel, her gown trailing behind her, her bouquet slipping from her hands and scattering petals across the stone floor. The villagers called out for her, but she did not stop. She fled through the fields, past the hedgerows, down the winding path that led to the bridge. Some tried to follow, but by the time they reached the edge of the river, she was already there, standing in the center of the bridge, framed by the mist rising from the water below. Witnesses described the scene in fragments. The way the silk of her dress shimmered like a ghost under the moonlight, the way she clutched the stone railing so tightly her knuckles turned white, the sound of her sobs carrying across the valley like a broken hymn. And then she was gone. Some said she leapt into the river, her gown spreading across the water like a pale shroud before the current pulled her under. Others believed she simply vanished, swallowed by the fog. No body was ever found. For days, villagers searched the riverbanks, dragging the waters, scouring the woods. Nothing. Not a shred of fabric. Not a trace of the girl who had once been the light of the village. Only her bouquet remained, lodged between the stones of the bridge, its petals wilted and brown. Grief turned quickly into whispers. Some murmured that Thomas had run away with another woman, leaving Eliza to face the shame of betrayal. Others whispered of darker things, that perhaps Thomas had been involved in a debt or a crime, and abandoning Eliza was his only escape. But there were those who believed something far more sinister, that Eliza had not merely died, but that her spirit had been trapped by her grief, cursed to wander until her vows were fulfilled. Not long after her disappearance, the stories began. Travelers who crossed the bridge late at night spoke of hearing faint sobs drifting on the wind. Farmers claimed to see a pale figure standing in the mist, the outline of a wedding dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. And then came the most chilling reports. Villagers swore that when they drew close, the figure turned her head, revealing eyes filled with endless sorrow, eyes that searched desperately, as though still looking for the man who had left her. The church tried to dismiss these tales as superstition, urging the villagers not to spread fear. But no amount of prayer or denial could stop the sightings. They grew more frequent with each passing year, until the name Bride's Bridge became fixed in the minds of all who lived nearby. Children were warned never to cross it at night, and lovers passing by would cling to each other more tightly, as though afraid the spirit of Eliza might mistake one of them for her long-lost groom. Over time, Thomas's name faded. Some claimed he left the country, never to be seen again. Others said he met a tragic end, as though fate had cursed him for his betrayal. Whatever the truth, it did not matter. His story was forgotten. But Eliza's remained. Her sorrow lived on, etched into the stones of the bridge, carried by the whispers of the villagers, and manifested in the chilling apparitions that haunted the night. Centuries passed, and still the legend endured. Eliza became less of a woman and more of a symbol, the symbol of love betrayed, of promises broken, of grief so deep it could outlast death itself. To some, she was a warning, to others, a mystery, but to those who had seen her, even from afar, she was a nightmare. The tragedy of Eliza was not merely a forgotten story. It was a wound that never healed, a memory preserved not in books or monuments, but in the cries of a restless spirit. And even now, when the fog drifts low across the water and the night grows silent, those who stand upon the bridge say they can still hear her sobs, as though she has been crying for hundreds of years, waiting for a man who will never return. And so the story lingers like the mist itself, always present, always ready to seep into the hearts of those foolish enough to cross the bridge after dark. For Eliza is not just a tale of the past. She is the sorrow that lives forever. As the years passed, the story of Eliza no longer remained just a tale of tragedy told by the elderly around flickering hearths. It grew into something darker, something living, carried on the tongues of travelers, whispered between strangers, and carved into the fears of those who dared to cross the bridge after the sun went down. For though many dismissed the legend as nothing more than folklore, the testimonies of those who encountered the bride on the bridge were too vivid, too consistent, and too haunting to ignore. It began with the accounts of carriage drivers in the 19th century, men accustomed to late-night journeys through the countryside. More than one claimed that their horses grew uneasy as they approached the bridge, stamping the ground nervously, refusing to cross. Some described how their animals stopped completely, ears pinned back, as if they sensed something invisible barring the way. One driver, a stout man who mocked superstition, recounted how he lashed his horse to force it across. But just as the carriage wheels reached the midpoint of the bridge, he swore he saw her, standing there, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face pale as moonlight, watching silently from the shadows. He pulled on the reins to stop, his heart pounding, but in an instant she was gone. Only the sound of the river rushing below remained. And yet, the air around him was so cold that his breath came out in great white plumes, as though winter itself had descended in that single spot. In later years, when automobiles replaced carriages, the accounts did not cease. In fact, they multiplied. Drivers returning from late-night shifts, couples on evening trips, and solitary travelers all described the same vision, a figure in white standing in the middle of the road. The headlights illuminated her form, a dress that trailed along the stones, fabric that shimmered though no wind stirred it, and a face that never quite looked human. Some swore she smiled, a strange and sorrowful curve of the lips that filled their hearts with unease. Others said she wept, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face. But every testimony shared the same chilling end. The moment they drew closer, she vanished, leaving nothing behind but a dreadful cold that lingered in the air long after the figure was gone. One man, a local schoolteacher, once told his story in the pub, though he spoke in a hushed tone as though fearing that the very mention of it might summon her again. He had been cycling home after visiting a friend, the night calm and quiet, the moon casting long silver shadows across the countryside. As he reached the bridge, he saw her, a young woman in white, standing motionless at the center. Thinking it was some poor girl in distress, he slowed down, calling out to her, asking if she was all right. She did not respond. Her head was bowed, her veil drifting across her face, hiding her features. He dismounted, hesitant but concerned, and stepped closer. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the stones, but she made no move, no sound. When he was just a few feet away, she finally lifted her head. Her eyes, he said, were hollow black pits filled with endless sorrow, and her mouth stretched into a silent scream. Before he could even react, she dissolved before his eyes, fading like smoke in the wind, leaving only a chill so bitter that his teeth chattered uncontrollably. He never crossed the bridge at night again. Another tale came from a young couple traveling by car one autumn evening. They were returning from a dance in the nearby town, laughter still on their lips, when their headlights caught a figure in white. At first, they thought it was someone in costume, perhaps a prankster. But as the car slowed, they realized the figure was a bride. The young woman in the passenger seat later recounted how the bride turned her head toward them. Her face twisted with grief, and then reached out her hand as though begging to be taken into the car. The driver panicked, swerved violently to avoid her, and nearly crashed into the railing. When they looked back, there was nothing there. The road was empty, the mist swirling in silence. For weeks after, the girl claimed she could still hear soft crying in her dreams, as though the spirit of the bride had followed her home. There were also stories of those who claimed to feel her presence without ever seeing her. A soldier returning from war described walking across the bridge one night when a sudden weight pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His body grew numb with cold, and though the night was still, he heard the faint rustle of silk brushing against the stone beside him. He hurried his steps, refusing to look around, but the sensation of someone walking just behind him never faded until he reached the other side. When he turned back, the bridge was empty, bathed in moonlight. He swore that in the silence just before he left, he heard a woman's voice whisper, "Wait for me." What made the testimonies most terrifying was not just their detail, but their persistence. Decades apart, witnesses described the same figure, the same gown, the same chilling atmosphere. Some claimed she smiled, others said she wept, but all agreed she was there, lingering at the very center of the bridge, a ghost of sorrow bound to the stone. Scientists and skeptics dismissed it as the tricks of fog and shadow, or the inventions of frightened minds. Yet even they could not explain the accounts of sudden temperature drops, the electrical failures in cars that stalled on the bridge, or the way some recordings captured faint, inexplicable sobs in the background. The villagers grew used to these tales, though never comfortable with them. Whenever someone new moved to town, it was only a matter of time before they, too, would hear the story. Some laughed it off, daring each other to walk the bridge at midnight. But those who did often returned pale and shaken, unwilling to speak of what they had seen or heard. The story became a kind of silent agreement among the people. Yes, she was there, yes, she was real, and no, one did not tempt fate by seeking her out. One of the most chilling accounts came from a lorry driver who had been delivering goods late one winter night. Snow had begun to fall, covering the ground in a white blanket, and the bridge ahead seemed almost otherworldly in the glow of his headlights. As he crossed, he saw her standing at the far end, her gown blending seamlessly into the snow. He slowed, thinking it was a stranded woman, but as he approached, she turned her head toward him, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. It was pale, yes, but more than that. It was sorrow carved into flesh, her mouth trembling as though about to cry, her eyes hollow with despair so deep it felt endless. He froze, gripping the wheel, but in the blink of an eye she was gone, and his lorry rattled on across the stones. He later confessed that he nearly quit his job that night, so great was the fear that had settled in his bones. The testimonies did not stop with drivers and travelers. Even locals, people who had lived by the river all their lives, spoke of strange experiences. Fishermen swore they heard weeping carried over the water at night, even when no one was near. Children claimed they saw a woman in white standing silently in the fields, watching them from afar. An elderly woman once told her granddaughter that she had met the bride herself as a girl, walking home from a friend's house. The woman had appeared beside her on the bridge, drifting without sound, and whispered into her ear, "Do you know where he is?" The girl had run all the way home, never looking back. And yet, despite the fear, the sightings carried a strange, sorrowful weight. For most who spoke of her did not describe her as malevolent or violent. She was not a monster lurking in the dark, nor a demon seeking blood. She was something else entirely, something sad, lost, and eternal. She was grief given form, a heartbroken soul trapped in endless waiting. But it was this very sorrow that terrified people most, for there was no reasoning with it, no fighting against it. One could only witness it and hope to leave unscathed. The bride's bridge remained a place of passage, for life had to go on, but it was also a place of silence, a place where people crossed quickly, never daring to linger, never daring to look too long into the mist. For they all knew the stories, they had all heard the testimonies, and they all feared that one day they might not just see her, but that she might see them. And if she did, if her sorrowful eyes ever fixed on theirs, what then? Would she mistake them for the groom who had abandoned her? Would she reach out, begging, pleading, demanding that they stay? No one knew. But everyone feared the same thing, that the moment she touched you, you would never leave the bridge again. It began on a cold Saturday night when a group of 5 friends from the nearby city decided to test their courage. They had grown up hearing whispers of the bride's bridge, but had never truly believed them. To them, it was just another ghost story told by bored villagers to frighten children. But the legend's persistence intrigued them, and in an age where everything could be recorded, documented, and uploaded, they thought it might be fun to turn the haunting into their own viral video. With cameras packed, batteries charged, and laughter bubbling on their lips, they set out to the countryside, never realizing how different the night would end compared to how it began. The drive was filled with jokes and mockery. They passed a bottle of cheap liquor between them, daring one another to be the first to step onto the bridge alone, to call out the name of the ghost bride, or to ask her to appear. One of them, a tall boy named Adam, kept repeating that he didn't believe in any of it. "Ghosts aren't real," he said. "It's all shadows and stories. If anything shows up on camera, it's just fog." His words were met with laughter, but behind the noise there was still unease, though none of them dared to admit it aloud. By the time they reached the bridge, the night had grown unnervingly still. The road that led there was narrow, bordered by fields and trees that seemed to close in the further they drove. When they stopped the car, the headlights illuminated the old stone arch ahead, the bridge rising out of the mist like something from another time. The stones were dark with age, the railings cracked and weathered, and the river below whispered faintly in the silence. They got out, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes breaking the quiet. Each carried a camera or a phone, their devices blinking with the red light of recording. They laughed again, though their voices sounded too loud against the stillness, bouncing off the stone as though the bridge itself was listening. "All right," said Mia, the girl holding the main camera. "Here we are, the infamous bride's bridge. Let's see if the ghost wants to be on YouTube." First, it was almost fun. They walked to the center, flashing lights in every direction, zooming in on the old stonework, filming each other pretending to be scared. One boy draped his jacket over his head like a veil and wailed mockingly, making the others laugh so hard they doubled over. For the first hour, there was nothing but their jokes, their voices, and the creak of the bridge beneath their steps. But as midnight drew closer, the air began to change. The laughter grew softer, as though the night itself was pressing down on them. A wind picked up, cold and sharp, rattling through the trees and carrying with it the smell of damp earth and river water. One of them checked his watch. "It's almost 12, he said, his voice quieter now. "That's supposed to be the hour, right?" They gathered near the center of the bridge, their camera lights creating small islands of brightness in the mist. For a long while nothing happened. Then, without warning, Mia's camera flickered. The screen went black. She shook it, pressed the buttons, but it refused to turn back on. One by one, the others checked their devices, and to their growing unease, each one faltered. Screens flickering, batteries dying despite being fully charged just an hour before. Within minutes, every light had gone out. The bridge was plunged into darkness, the only illumination the pale glow of the moon filtering weakly through the fog. "Okay, that's weird," Adam muttered, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just the cold messing with the batteries." But no one answered him. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Even the river seemed muted, as though the night held its breath. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, barely more than a sigh. A soft, broken noise that seemed to drift on the wind. The group froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was weeping. The unmistakable sob of a woman, low and trembling, carrying across the stones of the bridge. "Did you hear that?" whispered Mia. No one needed to answer. They had all heard it. The sobbing grew louder, closer, as though the source was moving toward them. The air grew icy, their breath puffing into mist. They huddled together instinctively, their earlier bravado dissolving into dread. The crying was no longer distant. It was on the bridge with them. "I don't like this," one of them whispered. "Hello," Adam called out, though his voice shook. "Is someone there? Are you hurt?" There was no reply. Only the sobbing echoing from somewhere ahead. Slowly, hesitantly, they turned their heads toward the center of the bridge. She was there. A pale figure stood in the fog, her gown long and tattered, the veil covering her face drifting in the night air. Her body was still, her hands clasped as though holding invisible flowers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound was the sobbing, and it was clear now. It came from her. Mia gasped, stumbling back, nearly falling. One of the others whispered, "Oh my God," over and over like a prayer. Adam, who had mocked the legend all night, stood rooted in place, his face drained of color. "Run," someone said. But they did not. They could not. The figure lifted her head slowly, the veil shifting just enough for them to glimpse the pale outline of a face beneath. Her features were blurred, as though the mist itself had shaped them, but her eyes glowed with hollow darkness, empty yet filled with endless sorrow. She did not smile. She did not scream. She only stared, her head tilted, as if she were trying to recognize them. The sobbing stopped. The silence was worse. And then, without warning, the wind surged. It roared through the bridge, tearing at their clothes, howling like a chorus of voices. The figure began to move, drifting forward, her gown dragging soundlessly across the stones. That broke their paralysis. Someone screamed. The group turned and bolted, their footsteps pounding against the bridge, echoing in frantic rhythm. The cold clawed at them, the fog wrapping around their bodies, disorienting them. They ran, but the bridge seemed endless, stretching farther than it should, as though the night itself was keeping them trapped. Behind them, the sobbing returned, louder, harsher, a wail that pierced through the wind. One of the boys risked a glance back and saw her closer now, much closer than she should have been, drifting after them. Her veil torn back to reveal a face twisted with grief, her mouth open in a silent cry. He stumbled, fell to the stones, and shouted for help. The others tried to pull him up, but the cold was overwhelming, their limbs heavy as if the air itself was pressing them down. Finally, with a desperate surge, they crossed the end of the bridge, collapsing onto the gravel road. The moment their feet left the stones, the wind ceased. The sobbing vanished. The fog thinned, revealing the bridge behind them empty, silent, innocent. For a long time they lay there, gasping, unable to speak. When at last they looked at each other, their faces were pale, eyes wide with the weight of what they had seen. None of them laughed. None of them spoke of shadows or myths. They climbed into the car in silence, too afraid to look back, and drove until the bridge was far behind them. Later, when they checked their cameras, they found only static. Every recording had been corrupted, the files unreadable, except for one. On Mia's phone, though the screen had died that night, a single file remained. It was less than a minute long, grainy, filled with distortion. But through the static, one sound was clear, the sobbing of a woman echoing endlessly, long after the group had fled. They deleted the video, but it did not matter. For weeks afterward, each of them claimed to hear it again, faintly in the quiet moments before sleep, the sound of a bride weeping in the dark, as though she had followed them home. The night after their first encounter, none of them could sleep. Each tried to convince themselves it had been a trick of the fog, a shared hallucination brought on by nerves, or maybe even some cruel prank someone else had orchestrated to scare them. But deep down, they all knew the truth. What they had seen, what they had heard, was not human. The sobbing had been real. The figure had been real. And despite fleeing the bridge, they couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left her behind. Days passed, but the silence between them spoke louder than any words. They avoided the topic, yet nightmares haunted their sleep. Mia dreamed of the veil brushing against her face, of icy hands clutching her wrists. Adam woke drenched in sweat, swearing he had heard crying in his apartment, echoing faintly through the walls. Another friend refused to be alone at night, keeping all his lights on until morning. But the most terrifying detail was unspoken. Each of them, in their own way, heard the sobbing when no one else was around. It should have been enough to keep them away forever, but human curiosity has always been a dangerous thing. A week later, Adam suggested returning. His voice trembled when he said it, but there was a defiance in his eyes. "We didn't prove anything," he insisted. "No one's going to believe us. If we go back, if we record it properly, then at least we'll have proof." The others resisted, but the unease of not knowing gnawed at them. They wanted to believe they had imagined it. They wanted to believe they could shine light on the darkness and see nothing more than mist and stone. So, reluctantly, they agreed. They armed themselves with stronger cameras, fresh batteries, flashlights, and even a small recorder to capture audio. More importantly, they told themselves they would stick together no matter what. When they arrived, the night was colder than before. The fog came early, rolling in thick waves that clung to the trees and crawled along the road like living shadows. Their car headlights barely cut through the gray, and when they reached the bridge, the structure appeared as nothing more than a vague outline, swallowed almost entirely by mist. They stepped out cautiously this time. No jokes, no laughter. The bridge loomed ahead, its stones damp with condensation, the air heavy and oppressive. The sound of the river was distant, muffled as though the fog absorbed every noise. Flashlights cut thin paths through the haze, but even the beams seemed to falter, swallowed by the gray. They advanced slowly, the crunch of gravel under their shoes the only reminder that they were still in the world of the living. Each step echoed too loudly, bouncing back from unseen corners of the night. It felt wrong, as though the bridge were no longer just a place but a threshold, something alive, waiting. Halfway across they stopped. The mist thickened, coiling like smoke, until it was almost impossible to see one another. Adam raised his voice, though it shook. "Hello, is anyone here?" His words were devoured by the fog, returning only as a faint whisper. For a moment there was nothing. Then Mia froze. Her flashlight wavered, catching something in the distance. At the far end of the bridge, a figure stood, faint, almost part of the fog itself. She wore white. Her gown was long, shredded at the edges, swaying as though moved by a wind that did not touch them. The group went still, every breath caught in their throats. The figure did not move. She stood in silence, her head bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her veil was torn, strands of hair matted against the fabric. One of the boys whispered, "It's her." As if hearing him, the figure lifted her head. The fog shifted, parting just enough to reveal her face. It was not clear, not whole, but her eyes shone through, black, empty hollows that locked onto them with unbearable weight. She did not blink. She did not look away. She only stared, and the longer they stared back, the more it felt as though something inside them was unraveling. Panic surged. They turned to run, their flashlights swinging wildly, but the bridge seemed wrong. Each step forward led them deeper into the mist, yet the far end of the bridge never grew closer. The figure, however, did. With every frantic glance over their shoulders, she was nearer, though she had never moved. Her gown dragged soundlessly across the stones, her presence pressing against them, suffocating cold. "Keep running," Adam shouted, his voice cracking. But the harder they ran, the closer she became. Her black eyes widened, and for the first time she opened her mouth. A sound tore through the fog, a cry so raw, so filled with despair and fury, that it made their bones ache. The wail rose and fell, stretching into the night, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. They clutched their ears, screaming, but the sound wasn't only outside. It was inside, reverberating through their skulls, their hearts. One of them stumbled, falling to his knees, clutching his chest. He gasped for breath, his lips turning pale. The others tried to drag him up, but the air itself was thick, heavy, like water closing around them. The bride was almost upon them now, her veil fluttering though there was no breeze, her gown brushing the stones just inches away. Mia screamed and swung her flashlight toward the figure. For a split second, the beam cut across her face, and what it revealed was worse than darkness. Her features twisted, half-rotted, half-frozen in eternal grief. Her mouth gaped open, her jaw too wide, her skin stretched thin over bone. From her eyes spilled streams of black tears that vanished into the mist. The light flickered and died. Darkness swallowed them. Blind, they clung to one another, stumbling forward. The bridge stretched on endlessly. Every step met with more fog, more stone, no escape. Behind them, the sobbing began again, softer now, but closer, always closer. It circled them, weaving through the mist, a sound that crawled under their skin. "Please," Mia whispered into the dark, her voice breaking. "We're sorry. We shouldn't have come." For the first time, the sobbing stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on every side. And then a whisper, so faint it was almost part of the air itself. "Stay." The word was not shouted, not screamed, but it was enough to freeze them where they stood. It was not a request. It was a command. Through the fog, the figure was there again, impossibly close. She reached out a hand, pale and skeletal, her fingers stretching toward them. They turned and ran without thought, their lungs burning, their vision spinning. And suddenly, impossibly, the end of the bridge appeared, the gravel road breaking through the mist. They burst free, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. The fog clung to the bridge but did not follow. They dared to look back, and there she was, standing at the threshold, her gown whipping in an invisible wind, her black eyes locked on them. She did not cross the line, but she did not fade. She stood there, waiting, her silhouette framed in the mist, a promise unspoken. When they finally drove away, their bodies trembling, their minds shattered, the bridge vanished behind them. Yet none of them felt safe. The sobbing lingered in their ears, and the memory of her eyes followed them like a shadow. Each knew, without speaking it aloud, that the bride had not let them go. She had only let them leave. For now. That night, long after they returned home, Mia woke to the sound of crying outside her window. Slow, broken sobs, carried on a windless night. When she dared to look, the street was empty. But in the glass reflection, just behind her shoulder, stood a pale figure in a torn wedding gown. The story of Eliza's ghost spread quickly after the group's encounter, whispered among neighbors, shared in hushed tones at roadside stalls, carried from one household to another like wildfire. What had once been dismissed as an old superstition became something more sinister, a curse that people felt pressing closer each night. The bridge no longer seemed like a simple structure of stone and iron. To the townsfolk, it had become a threshold to something forbidden, something alive, a place where the veil between the living and the dead had thinned to nothing. Parents began warning their children never to cross after dark. Old men swore they had seen shadows moving across the mist even in daylight. And at the heart of every tale was always the same figure. A woman in white, her gown torn, her eyes black and hollow, waiting for those foolish enough to test her grief. People called her the Bride of the Bridge, but the elders whispered her name, Eliza. The story was that she had been abandoned on her wedding night, betrayed by the man who had promised to love her. Stricken with despair, she had wandered to the bridge in her gown, her tears mingling with the fog, before the river swallowed her. Her body was never found. Her soul, however, lingered. What terrified the townspeople most was not just her presence, but her purpose. Eliza was not merely haunting the bridge. She was searching for the man who had left her, or anyone who could take his place. And if she found a young man alone on the bridge at night, she would not let him go. Some said she whispered softly at first, a plea woven with sorrow. Others said her voice turned sharp, desperate, clinging like cold fingers on the skin. But the words were always the same. "Don't leave me again." It was a phrase that seeped into the nightmares of every man who had ever crossed that bridge after dark. Some claimed they had heard it even when they weren't near the bridge, as if her voice followed them, etched into their ears, a curse that could not be shaken. One night, a local named Daniel, a boy of 21, ignored the warnings. He was practical, skeptical, the type who scoffed at ghost stories. His friends dared him to cross the bridge alone, and he laughed, saying he would prove once and for all that the legend was nothing but a tale. He left his car at the edge of the road and stepped onto the bridge with nothing but his phone light to guide him. First, it was just as he expected. The mist hung thick but silent. The stones were cold beneath his shoes, the river faintly audible far below. He walked confidently, mocking the whispers of the town, even recording a video to show he was unafraid. "See, nothing here," he said into the lens, his smile smug, his voice steady. But then, midway across, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath came out in white clouds, his skin prickling. He glanced behind him, and though the bridge stretched empty, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking just out of sight, following his steps. The rhythm of his footsteps seemed echoed, slightly off, as though another pair trailed him by a heartbeat. "Stop. Echo, stop." A nervous laugh escaped his lips, but it sounded hollow, brittle. He raised his phone light higher. The beam caught the shifting mist ahead, and there, just for an instant, he saw her, a woman in white, standing with her back to him, her veil lifting in an invisible breeze. He blinked and she was gone. His pulse quickened. He tried to tell himself it was only his imagination, the tricks of fog and fear. He pushed forward faster, desperate to reach the other side. That was when he heard it. A whisper, faint but clear, brushing against his ear though no one stood beside him. "Don't leave me again." His body locked. The phone nearly slipped from his hand. He spun around, the light darting across the fog, but the bridge was empty. The whisper came again, softer this time, curling like smoke around his mind. "Don't leave me again." Daniel broke. He ran, his shoes pounding the stones, his breath ragged. But the faster he ran, the louder the whispers grew, multiplying, surrounding him, until it felt as though dozens of voices pleaded all at once. His light flickered, and in that stuttering glow, he saw her face flash before him, gaunt, hollow, eyes like black voids swallowing all light. He reached the end of the bridge, stumbling onto the road, gasping for air. The fog clung to the bridge but did not cross, and when he dared to look back, she was there, standing in the mist, motionless, watching. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes locked onto his. She raised a hand, reaching out, though an invisible boundary kept her at bay. Daniel drove home shaking, swearing never to return. But that night, as he lay in bed, he woke to the sound of sobbing outside his door. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the words slipped through, a whisper wrapping around his very soul. "Don't leave me again." The next morning, his friends found him pale and sleepless, his eyes bloodshot, his body trembling. He refused to speak of what happened, but he never crossed the bridge again. Some said he left town entirely, unable to bear the weight of the voice that followed him. His story spread, fueling the legend further. The bridge became a forbidden place, avoided even in daylight. Travelers unfamiliar with the tale sometimes ventured across, but locals watched them with pity, whispering prayers for those who tempted the bride. The curse, however, was not confined to the bridge. More and more, men reported hearing the whisper elsewhere, walking home alone at night, waiting at a bus stop, even in their own rooms when the hour grew late. Some claimed to feel the brush of a veil against their cheek when no one stood nearby. Others said they woke to find their mirrors fogged, though the room was warm, and words traced faintly on the glass. "Don't leave me again." What made it worse was that the curse seemed selective. Women crossed the bridge without incident, though they often felt watched, uneasy, as if eyes tracked their movements. But for men, especially the young, the presence was stronger, more insistent, the whispers louder. Elders muttered that Eliza was searching not just for any man, but for the one who had abandoned her. Her grief so blind it could not tell the difference. Every young man became a candidate, every lonely figure on the bridge a possible groom she would not lose twice. The legend deepened with each telling. Some claimed that if a man answered her whisper, if he spoke back to her plea, she would bind herself to him. He would wake with the scent of damp flowers in his room, hear footsteps pacing outside his window, see the shadow of a veil in his dreams, and eventually he would disappear. Some said he joined her beneath the river, claimed as her eternal companion. Others swore they had seen men wandering the bridge at dawn, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering her words in perfect unison. "Don't leave me again." It was no longer just a ghost story. It was a curse, alive and hungry, reaching beyond the stones and the mist, marking its prey. And the most terrifying truth of all was that there was no escaping her once she chose you. The bridge was only the beginning. Even now, those who live nearby claim to hear her at night. A soft sob drifting across the fog, a whisper carried on a windless evening. Some men wake to the sensation of cold fingers brushing their hands, as though someone is trying to intertwine their fingers with hers. Others report dreams so vivid they wake in tears, dreams of standing at an altar, a bride in white beside them, her veil hiding her face, her grip so tight they cannot break free. When the veil is lifted, there are no eyes, only endless black, and the words that echo again and again, binding them to her sorrow. "Don't leave me again." The bridge still stands today, weathered but unyielding, its stones damp with centuries of fog and rain. To the locals, it is no longer just a crossing over the restless river. It is a scar carved into the land, a reminder of sorrow that refuses to fade. Time has reshaped the town around it. New houses, electric lights, paved roads have risen, yet the bridge itself resists change, locked in its own era. Its iron railings are corroded, its stones darkened by age, but it endures untouched by progress, as though bound by something greater than mortar and steel. By daylight, it attracts curious eyes. Tourists come with cameras slung over their necks, snapping pictures of the mist that clings stubbornly to its edges, laughing nervously as guides recount the tales. They buy trinkets at the nearby stalls, pendants of silver veils, small carved figurines of a bride in white, souvenirs meant to trivialize the curse into something consumable. Children point at the water below, throwing pebbles, daring each other to run across. In the sun, with crowds of strangers, it seems harmless, like any other bridge in any other town. But as dusk bleeds into night, the bridge changes. The mist thickens, swallowing the railings until only the center path remains visible. The air cools sharply, unnatural for the season, carrying with it a damp heaviness that clings to skin and sinks into bones. The laughter of tourists fades as the stalls close and the lamps flicker on, casting pale halos into the growing dark. Locals disappear indoors, shutting their windows, muttering prayers under their breath. By the time the clock nears midnight, the bridge is abandoned, left to its silence and the things that dwell within it. Still, not everyone stays away. Every year, a few who hear the legend come to test their courage. Young men mostly, students, thrill seekers, skeptics who dismiss the warnings as quaint folklore. They arrive with flashlights, sometimes with friends who wait at the edge, filming and cheering them on. They step onto the bridge grinning, waving, calling out that they will prove everyone wrong. Some return, pale and shaken, unwilling to speak of what they saw. Some return laughing, relieved, swearing they heard nothing but the wind. And some, the unlucky few, do not return at all. Those are the stories that spread the farthest. A boy from out of town who vanished after daring to cross at midnight. His belongings found on the far side, but no sign of him anywhere. A tourist who stumbled back an hour later, clothes soaked, eyes vacant, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't leave me again," until his voice broke into sobs. A skeptic who swore he felt a hand grip his wrist halfway across, icy and desperate, pulling him toward the rail, whispering words that made his skin crawl. He refused to finish telling the story, and 2 weeks later he was gone, his body discovered downstream. The legend evolves with each retelling, yet the essence remains unchanged. The bridge belongs to her, the bride, Eliza. Whatever name you give her, her presence lingers, clinging to the stones, to the fog, to the very air at the stroke of midnight. And no matter how many times people scoff, no matter how many insist it is just a story, the challenge endures, whispered as both a dare and a warning. Would you cross the bridge alone at 12 o'clock, when the veil is thinnest? Imagine it. The night is silent, the town asleep. You stand at the entrance, the lamps flickering weakly behind you, their glow barely touching the start of the path. The bridge stretches ahead, swallowed in mist, the far side invisible. The river beneath roars faintly, hidden but ever present, its voice like a constant murmur in the dark. You take your first step, the stone cool underfoot, the air heavier with every breath. First it feels easy. The silence is only silence. Your footsteps echo, crisp and solitary, the beam of your flashlight cutting through the white veil ahead. You remind yourself it's just a story, a superstition kept alive by fear. But as you move further, the night begins to change. The echoes of your steps sound doubled, as though someone walks behind you, just out of sight, their pace matching yours perfectly. You stop and the sound stops too. You shine the light back, but there is nothing, only the rolling fog, thick and impenetrable. Temperature drops. Your skin prickles with gooseflesh, and every breath you exhale clouds before your face. You grip the railing, and it is damp, slick, as though something cold and alive has brushed against it moments before. The mist curls strangely around you, folding in on itself, shaping forms that almost resemble figures before dissolving. And then, faintly, you hear it. At first it is distant, fragile, the sound of a woman crying somewhere ahead. You freeze, telling yourself it must be the river, the shifting air, a trick of sound. But it comes again, clearer this time, a broken wail that carries the weight of endless sorrow. The hair at the back of your neck rises, your stomach knots, and instinct screams for you to turn back. Yet the dare pulls you forward, step by cautious step, until the sobbing grows louder, nearer, more human. Then you see her. She stands at the far end of the bridge, or what little of it you can see. A figure in white, the fabric of her gown torn and dragging, her veil lifting as though by a breeze that does not touch you. Her face is obscured, hidden in shadow, but her posture is unmistakable. Still waiting, watching. You tell yourself it is a trick of fog, that your mind is conjuring her from the stories you've heard. You blink and she is closer. Blink again and closer still, though her feet do not move. Your chest tightens. You force your legs to run to close the distance to safety, but the harder you push, the more the space stretches. The figure does not retreat. She looms larger, impossibly near, her veil now just yards away. And then, before you can scream, you hear her voice. It is not a shout, not a wail, but a whisper so soft it seems to come from inside your head. "Don't leave me again." The words seep into your bones, sweet and venomous, wrapping around your heart. You feel a tug at your hand, light at first, then firm, as though fingers cold and desperate have intertwined with yours. The air thickens with her presence, the sobbing rising around you, and you realize with horror that it is not one voice but many, echoing endlessly, all whispering the same plea. If you glance to the side, you see her face at last. Hollow eyes, black and endless, fixed on you with an intimacy that chills the marrow of your bones. Her lips tremble as she repeats the words, her grip tightening, her body pressing closer though she never truly moves. The bridge tilts beneath you, the stones trembling, the river roaring louder, calling. You wrench free, running with every shred of strength, and somehow you stumble onto solid ground, collapsing against the dirt road. The mist clings to the bridge behind you, and when you dare to look back, she is there, always there, standing at the threshold, watching with eyes that promise she will wait as long as it takes. Some return from this encounter alive, broken but breathing. Others vanish, their screams swallowed by the river, their names etched only in whispers. And still the question lingers. The bridge remains, unbroken, unburned, immune to the passage of time, its curse eternal. So now it is asked of you, not as a tale, not as entertainment, but as a challenge that has drawn countless souls into its grasp. Would you step onto that bridge at midnight, knowing what awaits? Would you trust your courage against centuries of grief, against the endless plea of a bride who will never let go? The stones will be cold beneath your feet. The mist will swallow you whole. The sobbing will rise until it drowns your thoughts, and the whisper will brush against your ear, gentle yet suffocating. And when you see her, when you feel her hand seeking yours, there will be no one to save you, no one to hear you, no one to wake you from the nightmare. The bridge still waits. The bride still waits. The only question left is this: would you dare to cross it alone?